By late autumn of 1944, Allied forces in Western Europe believed they had entered the final phase of the campaign. The breakout from Normandy had succeeded, Paris had been liberated, and German forces were retreating toward their own borders. Operational momentum appeared firmly in Allied hands, supported by overwhelming superiority in manpower, logistics, and air power. This perception shaped both planning and expectations. Allied command assumed that German forces in the West were no longer capable of conducting large-scale offensive operations. Fuel shortages, equipment losses, and sustained pressure were believed to have reduced the German army to a defensive posture, focused on delay rather than initiative. The central question was how quickly Allied forces could translate their advantage into final victory. The German counteroffensive in the Ardennes challenged these assumptions. Launched under conditions of secrecy, limited resources, and extreme risk, the operation temporarily disrupted Allied plans, halted the advance in key sectors, and exposed vulnerabilities created by overextension and expectation of inevitability. While the counteroffensive could not change the strategic balance of the war, it succeeded in forcing a pause and imposing costs at a critical moment. The Ardennes counteroffensive was not an irrational gamble detached from military logic. It was a calculated attempt to exploit Allied assumptions, terrain, weather, and command dispersion in order to regain operational initiative, even if only temporarily. Its partial success revealed how strategic advantage can be constrained by timing, readiness, and the limits of planning under conditions of perceived dominance. Understanding this campaign requires moving beyond narratives of surprise or desperation and examining the strategic calculations on both sides. The counteroffensive did not occur because Germany was strong, but because the conditions briefly allowed strength to matter, and because Allied superiority had not yet translated into irreversible control. The German decision to launch a counteroffensive in the Ardennes was rooted in a specific strategic assessment made during the autumn of 1944. By that point, German leadership no longer believed that the war could be won through prolonged defense or attritional resistance. Industrial capacity was declining, fuel shortages were severe, and Allied superiority in manpower and material was overwhelming. The remaining question was not how to reverse defeat, but whether it was possible to alter the conditions under which defeat would occur. From the German perspective, the Western Front presented a narrowing window of opportunity. Allied forces were advancing rapidly but unevenly. Supply lines were stretched, command structures were dispersed, and confidence in imminent victory was widespread. German intelligence assessed that certain sectors of the front were thinly held, particularly in areas considered unsuitable for major operations. The Ardennes, with its dense forests and limited road network, fit this profile. The core German assumption was that Allied operational success had produced predictability. The advance was structured around logistical hubs, clear axes of movement, and expectations of limited enemy initiative. German planners believed that if they could strike where Allied defenses were light and reaction time was slow, they could achieve surprise at the operational level, even without overall superiority. This assessment shaped the objective of the counteroffensive. The aim was not to destroy Allied forces outright, but to disrupt cohesion, seize key transportation nodes, and force a pause long enough to regain strategic leverage. By driving a wedge through Allied lines and threatening rear areas, German command hoped to destabilize the coalition, delay further advances, and possibly force a negotiated outcome more favorable than unconditional collapse. Terrain played a central role in this calculation. The Ardennes offered concealment from air reconnaissance, limited Allied armor maneuver, and funneled movement into predictable routes that could be exploited by concentrated attack. Winter conditions were expected to further reduce Allied air effectiveness and slow reaction. These factors did not guarantee success, but they reduced the disparity between German limitations and Allied advantages. Risk was fully acknowledged. German leadership understood that failure would accelerate defeat by consuming irreplaceable reserves. However, in their assessment, continued defense offered no path to influence the war's outcome. The counteroffensive was therefore conceived not as a conventional campaign, but as a calculated attempt to exploit a temporary imbalance between Allied confidence and Allied readiness. This strategic logic explains why the Ardennes counteroffensive was launched despite overwhelming odds. It was not driven by illusion of victory, but by recognition that only a disruption of Allied momentum could meaningfully alter the final phase of the war, and that the conditions for such disruption were fleeting. The execution of the Ardennes counteroffensive relied on a precise alignment of timing, concealment, and initial momentum. German planners understood that surprise was the operation's most valuable asset. Without it, numerical inferiority and logistical weakness would quickly assert themselves. The opening phase therefore focused on achieving operational shock before Allied command could react coherently. Secrecy was enforced through strict movement controls and communications discipline. Units were shifted into assembly areas at night. Radio traffic was minimized, and deception measures were employed to mask intent. The Ardennes terrain, long considered unsuitable for large-scale operations, further reduced Allied suspicion. This environment allowed German forces to concentrate without immediate detection. Weather conditions played a decisive role in enabling the initial advance. Overcast skies and winter storms grounded much of the Allied air force, temporarily neutralizing one of the Allies' most significant advantages. With air interdiction reduced, German columns were able to move along key routes with less interference than would otherwise have been possible, narrowing the operational gap between the two sides. The initial assaults achieved tactical success in several sectors. Thinly held Allied positions were overrun, road junctions were seized, and forward units were forced into rapid defensive action. The speed of the advance disrupted communications and created uncertainty about the scale and intent of the attack. For a brief period, German forces regained the initiative and dictated the tempo of operations. However, this momentum depended on continuous movement and rapid exploitation. German units were constrained by limited fuel, narrow roads, and the need to prioritize key objectives over consolidation. Every delay reduced the operational window. Resistance at critical points, even when localized, had disproportionate effects on the overall plan. One such point was Bastogne, whose road network made it a focal node for movement in the region. The inability to seize it quickly forced German forces to divert effort and time, disrupting schedules and fragmenting the advance. What had been planned as a swift penetration began to slow under the weight of accumulated friction. Allied response, though initially disorganized, benefited from depth and flexibility. Units fell back, regrouped, and established blocking positions. Commanders prioritized delay over counterattack, trading space for time while reserves were mobilized. The very dispersion that had created vulnerability also allowed for adaptation once the scale of the threat became clear. As the opening phase progressed, the limits of the German plan began to emerge. Fuel shortages became more acute, road congestion increased, and coordination between advancing units weakened. The counteroffensive had succeeded in creating surprise and disruption, but it had not yet achieved the decisive rupture required to force a broader operational collapse. This phase demonstrated both the strength and fragility of the German approach. Surprise could compensate for weakness only briefly. Once resistance stiffened and Allied systems began to react, the window for decisive exploitation narrowed rapidly, setting the conditions for a shift from momentum to containment. As the German advance slowed, the counteroffensive entered a phase defined less by surprise and more by systemic constraints on both sides. The initial shock had been absorbed, and the campaign now depended on whether German forces could sustain pressure long enough to force Allied command into strategic compromise. This transition exposed the structural limits that planning and concealment could not overcome. Allied response during this phase was shaped by rapid consolidation of command and priorities. Once the scale of the attack was understood, authority and resources were centralized to restore coherence. Under the direction of Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, units were reoriented from advance to containment, with emphasis placed on holding key road networks, stabilizing flanks, and preserving freedom of movement for reserves. This response did not require immediate counterattack. It relied on depth, redundancy, and time. Allied forces accepted temporary loss of ground in exchange for preserving operational options. Communications were restored, supply routes were adjusted, and air assets were prepared to re-enter the fight once weather permitted. The priority was not to defeat the German advance at once, but to prevent it from expanding beyond manageable limits. German forces, meanwhile, encountered constraints that planning could not eliminate. Fuel shortages intensified as the advance extended supply lines deeper into contested territory. Vehicles were abandoned, not due to combat loss, but because movement could not be sustained. Road congestion increased vulnerability, and the requirement to prioritize limited resources forced difficult trade-offs between speed and security. Coordination also suffered. The offensive relied on multiple axes converging within narrow corridors. Delays on one axis affected others, and the loss of tempo reduced the ability to synchronize effort. As resistance stiffened, German units increasingly fought isolated engagements that consumed time without advancing the overall objective. Weather, which had initially favored the attack, became a neutral factor rather than an advantage. As skies cleared, Allied air power reasserted itself, targeting movement, supply columns, and exposed concentrations. Even limited air activity imposed disproportionate effects on an offensive that depended on uninterrupted movement and concealment. At this stage, the counteroffensive's strategic premise was effectively exhausted. The operation had succeeded in creating surprise and delay, but it had not achieved the decisive operational breakthrough required to alter the campaign's trajectory. Allied command cohesion improved faster than German forces could compensate for material and logistical imbalance. The battle thus entered a containment phase. German forces continued to press forward where possible, but the initiative was slipping. Each day without decisive gain increased Allied advantage and reduced German flexibility. What had begun as an attempt to reshape the end of the war was now constrained by the same structural realities that had made such an attempt necessary. As the counteroffensive stalled, the focus of the campaign shifted from German exploitation to Allied stabilization. This phase was defined not by dramatic reversals, but by the steady reassertion of structural advantages that had been temporarily suppressed by surprise and weather. The question was no longer whether the German advance could succeed, but how quickly the Allies could restore operational balance without overcommitting to premature counteraction. Allied command decisions during this period emphasized control over momentum. Rather than rushing to reclaim lost ground, commanders prioritized sealing penetrations, securing key road junctions, and preventing the German forces from widening their salient. This approach reflected a clear understanding of the operational situation. Time favored the Allies as long as cohesion and supply could be maintained. The restoration of air power was central to this process. As weather conditions improved, Allied aircraft resumed interdiction of movement and supply. German columns, already constrained by fuel shortages and road congestion, became increasingly vulnerable. Air attacks did not annihilate advancing units, but they imposed cumulative delay and attrition that further reduced the feasibility of sustained defensive action. Logistics now emerged as the decisive constraint. German forces were operating beyond their practical supply limits. Captured fuel stocks proved insufficient and unreliable. Ammunition expenditure increased while resupply diminished. Vehicles and artillery were lost not primarily to combat, but to abandonment and mechanical failure. Each loss narrowed future options and accelerated operational exhaustion. Allied logistics, by contrast, demonstrated resilience despite disruption. Supply routes were rerouted, depots repositioned, and priorities adjusted to support containment and eventual counteroffensive. The ability to absorb shock and continue functioning under pressure proved as important as numerical superiority. The campaign highlighted the difference between forces designed for sustained operations and those reliant on short-term exploitation. Command cohesion also improved rapidly on the Allied side. Initial confusion gave way to coordinated action across national and service boundaries. Decisions were made with an emphasis on preserving the larger operational framework rather than achieving immediate tactical success. This restraint prevented German forces from exploiting Allied reactions and limited the counteroffensive's potential impact. By this stage, the German operation had lost its strategic rationale. What remained was a series of localized engagements fought under increasingly unfavorable conditions. The initiative had shifted irreversibly. German forces continued to resist, but their actions were now reactive, focused on survival and withdrawal rather than exploitation. This phase underscored the core dynamic of the Ardennes counteroffensive. Surprise could disrupt superior forces briefly, but it could not overcome systemic imbalance. Once Allied structures recovered, the offensive's outcome was no longer in doubt. The battle moved steadily toward resolution, shaped less by dramatic confrontation than by the quiet reassertion of logistical and operational reality. By late December of 1944, the Ardennes counteroffensive had entered its decisive phase. The German advance had been contained, its momentum broken, and its capacity for further exploitation sharply reduced. What followed was not an abrupt collapse, but a gradual transition in which the initiative passed fully and irreversibly to the Allied side. At this point, the German operation faced a fundamental imbalance between objective and capability. The original plan required sustained forward movement, seizure of critical infrastructure, and exploitation before Allied superiority could reassert itself. None of these conditions now existed. Fuel shortages were acute, reserves were depleted, and units were increasingly fragmented. The offensive had consumed the very resources it depended upon. Allied commanders, aware that time favored them, avoided unnecessary risk. Rather than seeking dramatic encirclements or rapid counterthrusts, they applied steady pressure designed to reduce the salient methodically. This approach minimized exposure and preserved combat power. The goal was not speed, but certainty. Every German position regained narrowed the scope of resistance and reduced the possibility of renewed initiative. Weather continued to shape operations, but now in a different way. Improved conditions allowed consistent air operations, reinforcing Allied advantages and constraining German movement. Roads became hazardous, not only due to combat, but due to constant observation and attack. Movement by day became increasingly costly, while movement by night offered limited relief as fuel and coordination deteriorated. German units attempted to hold ground where possible, but defensive coherence weakened. Withdrawal became increasingly disorganized as equipment was abandoned and communications broke down. The defensive posture that had briefly stabilized the advance now served primarily to slow the inevitable contraction of the salient. Delay remained the objective, but delay no longer offered strategic value. The psychological dimension also shifted. For Allied forces, the initial shock of the counteroffensive had given way to confidence, rooted in restored control. For German forces, the realization that the operation could not succeed undermined cohesion and morale. Orders to continue resistance reflected necessity rather than belief in outcome. The counteroffensive had reached the limit of what it could impose on the strategic situation. By early January of 1945, the battle had effectively transitioned from German initiative to Allied resolution. The Ardennes counteroffensive no longer posed a threat to the broader campaign. Its remaining impact lay in the resources it consumed and the time it delayed Allied operations, not in any lasting alteration of the war's trajectory. This phase confirmed the central reality of the campaign. The counteroffensive succeeded tactically in creating surprise and delay, but failed strategically because it could not be sustained. Once Allied systems absorbed the shock and reasserted their advantages, the outcome became a matter of process rather than possibility. The Allied counteroffensive that followed the stabilization of the front was shaped by lessons learned during the initial German advance. Commanders were determined to avoid the same vulnerabilities that had allowed the counteroffensive to achieve surprise. Operations were therefore planned deliberately, with emphasis on coordination, logistics, and preservation of operational cohesion rather than rapid pursuit. Allied forces approached the reduction of the salient as a problem of control rather than speed. The objective was to compress German positions, restore the original front line, and eliminate the remaining capacity for organized resistance. This required synchronized movement from multiple directions, careful timing, and sustained logistical support under winter conditions. Unlike the German offensive, Allied operations did not depend on concealment or short-term momentum. They relied on endurance. Artillery, armor, infantry, and air power were integrated methodically, with each advance supported by secure supply lines and clear command relationships. Progress was steady rather than dramatic, but it was cumulative and irreversible. German forces, now fully on the defensive, faced a narrowing set of options. Units were ordered to hold positions despite shortages of fuel, ammunition, and replacements. Defensive actions were conducted under constant pressure, often without the ability to reposition effectively. What had once been an elastic defense became increasingly rigid as withdrawal routes closed and cohesion deteriorated. Weather and terrain continued to impose costs on both sides, but the balance of advantage had shifted decisively. Allied logistics absorbed winter conditions more effectively, while German systems, already strained, could not compensate. The ability to rotate units, replace losses, and maintain pressure without exhaustion proved decisive over time. The reduction of the salient was not a single operation, but a sequence of actions that gradually erased the gains achieved during the counteroffensive. Each village retaken, each road reopened, reduced the operational space available to German forces. Resistance continued, but it no longer shaped the campaign. It reacted to it. By mid-January of 1945, the strategic significance of the Ardennes fighting had ended. German forces had expended their last operational reserve in the West without achieving a lasting effect. Allied momentum, briefly interrupted, was now restored under conditions of greater caution and improved readiness. This phase demonstrated the fundamental asymmetry between the two sides. German operations depended on opportunity and risk. Allied operations depended on capacity and endurance. Once the opportunity passed, risk became unsustainable, and the counteroffensive collapsed into a defensive struggle that could not alter the outcome of the war. The Ardennes counteroffensive left consequences that extended beyond the immediate restoration of the front line. It reshaped how Allied command evaluated risk, readiness, and the assumption of inevitability in the final months of the war. The episode demonstrated that superiority, while decisive over time, does not eliminate vulnerability when expectations outpace preparation. One of the most significant outcomes was a recalibration of Allied operational caution. The belief that German forces were incapable of major initiative had influenced deployment, rest cycles, and sector assignments. The counteroffensive exposed the cost of that belief. After the Ardennes, Allied command treated remaining German capacity for disruption with greater seriousness, even as overall defeat became certain. This shift affected planning for subsequent operations. Greater emphasis was placed on reserve depth, flank security, and continuous intelligence assessment. Advances were still pursued aggressively, but with an increased awareness that surprise could occur even under conditions of overwhelming advantage. The campaign reinforced the principle that momentum must be protected, not assumed. For German forces, the counteroffensive marked the exhaustion of strategic choice in the West. The operation had been conceived as a way to restore initiative or force delay on favorable terms. Its failure consumed the last reserves capable of shaping events beyond local defense. After the Ardennes, German actions were increasingly constrained to reactive measures aimed at slowing advance rather than influencing outcomes. The battle also clarified the relationship between delay and decision. The counteroffensive succeeded in imposing a pause, but that pause did not translate into leverage. Time gained was not convertible into improved position or negotiation. In this sense, the operation highlighted the limits of delay when underlying power balances are irreversible. At an institutional level, the Ardennes reinforced the value of systems designed for endurance. Allied logistics, command structures, and coalition coordination absorbed shock and recovered quickly. These systems did not prevent disruption, but they prevented disruption from becoming decisive. The contrast between absorption and exhaustion defined the campaign's final balance. The legacy of the Ardennes counteroffensive therefore lies in its demonstration of how wars nearing conclusion can still produce strategic shocks without altering outcomes. The battle did not change the direction of the war, but it changed how the remainder of the war was conducted. It reduced complacency, refined caution, and reinforced the need to treat even a weakened opponent as capable of limited initiative. In this sense, the Ardennes was not an anomaly, but a warning delivered late in the conflict. It showed that superiority must be managed continuously, that assumptions require constant testing, and that the final phase of war can remain dangerous even when the result is no longer in doubt. The Ardennes counteroffensive stands as a final demonstration of how modern wars are shaped not only by strength, but by timing, expectation, and system resilience. The campaign did not overturn the strategic balance in Western Europe, yet it revealed how even a declining force could impose disruption when conditions briefly aligned in its favor. The German offensive succeeded where Allied assumptions had created space. Overconfidence in the enemy's exhaustion, combined with extended supply lines and uneven force distribution, produced vulnerability. The counteroffensive exploited that vulnerability effectively, but only within a narrow window. Once that window closed, the underlying imbalance of resources, logistics, and coordination reasserted itself decisively. For the Allies, the battle reinforced a critical lesson. Superiority does not eliminate friction. It must be continuously protected through readiness, reserve depth, and realistic assessment of the enemy. The pause imposed by the Ardennes was costly, but it strengthened Allied operational discipline for the final advance into Germany. For Germany, the counteroffensive marked the exhaustion of strategic agency in the West. The operation consumed remaining reserves without generating lasting leverage. After the Ardennes, German forces could still resist, but they could no longer shape events beyond delaying the inevitable. Initiative had passed permanently to the Allied side. The broader significance of the Ardennes counteroffensive lies in its clarification of cause and effect. Surprise can disrupt, terrain can conceal, and weather can level disparities, but none of these factors can substitute for sustained capacity. Temporary advantage does not become decision unless it can be converted into control, and control depends on systems that endure beyond the moment of shock. In final assessment, the Ardennes was not a failure of Allied power, nor a resurgence of German strength. It was a reminder that war remains contingent until it ends, and that the final stages of conflict can still produce danger, even when outcomes are settled. The counteroffensive delayed the advance, imposed cost, and forced reassessment, but it did not alter the destination. The campaign therefore closes not as a dramatic reversal, but as a lesson in strategic limits. The Ardennes counteroffensive showed how far disruption can go without decision, and why endurance, adaptation, and system resilience ultimately determine the outcome of war.